September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal. 800 U.S. Marines faced a tactical nightmare that should have meant certain death. Lieutenant Colonel Red Mike Edson received intelligence that 2,500 Japanese troops were moving through the jungle to surround his position on the ridge south of Henderson Field. Every military manual said the same thing. When outnumbered 3-1 and facing encirclement, you retreat. You find better ground. You call for reinforcements. Edson looked at his Marines, exhausted, low on ammunition, with nowhere to run, and made a decision that defied everything the textbooks taught. He ordered his men to tighten their perimeter. Let the enemy come closer. Let them surround the Marines completely. Through the humid darkness of the Pacific jungle, Japanese forces closed in from 3 sides, expecting to crush the Americans in a devastating night assault. What happened next would shatter every assumption about defensive warfare and turn a hopeless situation into one of the most lopsided victories in Marine Corps history. This is the story of how 800 Marines defied physics, logic, and every rule in the book. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to discover the truth. The impossible position. The humid air of Guadalcanal's jungle pressed against the Marines like a living thing as darkness settled over the ridge on September 13th. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson moved through his defensive positions with the measured steps of a man who had already accepted the mathematics of death. 800 Marines. 2,500 Japanese troops confirmed moving through the jungle below. The numbers didn't lie. But Edson had learned long ago that numbers rarely told the complete story. The ridge itself was barely worthy of the name, a low spine of coral and volcanic rock that rose perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding jungle, stretching roughly 1,000 yards in a north-south direction. To military strategists studying maps in Washington, it appeared insignificant. To the Marines digging in along its slopes, it represented the thin line between American control of Henderson Field and complete disaster in the Pacific. The airstrip lay just 800 yards to the north, close enough that they could hear the occasional drone of aircraft engines starting up in the pre-dawn darkness. Edson had positioned his forces with the calculated precision of a chess master playing for his life. The 1st Raider Battalion held the northern section of the ridge closest to Henderson Field, while the 1st Parachute Battalion stretched along the southern approaches. Between them, they commanded overlapping fields of fire across the jungle approaches. But Edson knew that firepower alone wouldn't save them. The Japanese had proven time and again that they would absorb horrific casualties to achieve their objectives. As Edson checked his positions, he found the man who would become a legend. Subscribe to War Chronicles, the machine gunner who changed everything. As Edson checked his positions, he found Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone adjusting the traverse mechanism on his Browning M1917 machine gun. The weapon was a relic from the previous war, water-cooled and weighing 41 pounds without its tripod, but it could sustain a rate of fire that would shred human flesh at ranges up to 1,500 yards. Basilone had already proven his worth in previous engagements, displaying the kind of steady competence under fire that separated seasoned Marines from the replacements still arriving from the States. "How's your ammunition situation, Gunny?" Edson asked, crouching beside the machine gun position. "Enough to make them think twice about coming up this hill, Colonel," Basilone replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that Edson had learned to rely upon. "Though I wouldn't mind having a few more belts if the Japanese decide to get serious about this." Private First Class Robert Leckie was dug in 20 yards to Basilone's left, his Springfield rifle cleaned and loaded, bayonet fixed. The young Marine had arrived on Guadalcanal barely 3 weeks earlier, still carrying the soft look of stateside training camps, but the jungle had already begun its transformation. His uniform hung loose on his frame, and his eyes held the particular alertness that came from knowing that death could arrive without warning from any direction. The Japanese strategy, as Edson understood it from intelligence reports and captured documents, relied on speed and shock. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's forces had been moving through the jungle for 3 days, following trails that only the most experienced guides could navigate in daylight. Their plan called for a coordinated night assault from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and the psychological impact of fighting in complete darkness. What the Japanese hadn't anticipated was the defensive preparation that Edson had implemented over the previous week. Every approach to the ridge had been studied, measured, and weaponized. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to see how. The trap springs shut. Every approach to the ridge had been studied, measured, and pre-registered for artillery fire. The Marines had cleared fields of fire through the jungle undergrowth, creating killing zones that would channel attacking forces into predetermined corridors. Wire obstacles, though limited by supply shortages, had been positioned to slow and funnel enemy troops into the most effective engagement ranges. As the night deepened, the sounds of the jungle began to change. The normal chorus of insects and nocturnal animals gradually gave way to an unnatural silence that every experienced Marine recognized as the prelude to contact. Somewhere in the darkness below the ridge, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving into position, their presence creating a disturbance that even the jungle wildlife could sense. At 11:45 p.m., the first Japanese mortar rounds began falling on the ridge. The explosions were scattered and poorly coordinated, suggesting that Kawaguchi's forces were still moving into position. But the shelling served its intended psychological purpose, announcing to the Marines that the battle they had been expecting was finally about to begin. Edson took his position at the command post, a shallow depression protected by sandbags and located at the highest point of the ridge. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire length of his defensive line and maintain radio contact with Henderson Field. The airstrip's artillery batteries were standing by to provide support, their guns already loaded and trained on predetermined target areas. Then the jungle erupted into chaos. The first wave of Japanese infantry broke from the tree line like a human avalanche. Subscribe to War Chronicle X. The first wave breaks. The first wave of Japanese infantry broke from the jungle like a human avalanche, their voices raised in the traditional Banzai cry that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific. But as they charged up the slopes of the ridge, they encountered something that Major General Kawaguchi had not anticipated in his tactical planning. The Marines didn't break. They didn't retreat. Instead, they opened fire with a disciplined precision that turned the hillside into a slaughter zone. Basilon's machine gun began its deadly work at 800 yards, the heavy slugs from the Browning cutting through the advancing Japanese like a scythe through wheat. The weapon's water-cooled barrel allowed for sustained fire that bolt-action rifles simply couldn't match, and Basilone had positioned his gun to enfilade the primary approach route. Each burst sent 5 to 7 rounds downrange in less than 2 seconds, and at this range, every round that found its mark was lethal. The Japanese assault had been planned according to traditional infantry doctrine that emphasized speed and shock action. Kawaguchi's forces were expected to close the distance to American positions quickly, using darkness and overwhelming numbers to compensate for their limited firepower. But the ridge's terrain worked against them in ways that no amount of pre-battle reconnaissance could have revealed. Private Leckie sighted down his Springfield rifle and squeezed the trigger, watching a Japanese soldier stumble and fall 50 yards downslope from his position. The young Marine worked the bolt action smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round with the mechanical efficiency that months of training had drilled into his muscle memory. Around him, the distinctive crack of American rifles created a steady percussion that punctuated the deeper roar of the machine guns. What Kawaguchi had fundamentally misunderstood would cost him everything. Subscribe to War Chronicle X, the mathematics of death. What Kawaguchi had fundamentally misunderstood was the nature of American defensive doctrine. Japanese military thinking emphasized the spiritual superiority of the attack, the belief that determined infantry could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. American doctrine, by contrast, focused on maximizing firepower and creating interlocking fields of fire that would destroy attacking forces before they could close to effective range. The Marines had turned the ridge into a fortress designed to exploit every advantage that modern weapons could provide. The Japanese forces advancing up the southern approaches encountered their first devastating surprise when American mortar rounds began falling among their ranks. The Marines had pre-plotted every likely avenue of approach, measuring distances and calculating firing solutions during daylight hours when they could work without fear of enemy observation. Now, in the darkness, those calculations paid dividends as high-explosive shells detonated with lethal precision among the closely packed Japanese infantry. Corporal Watanabe led his squad through the undergrowth, desperately seeking cover as American bullets whined overhead and mortar fragments whistled through the jungle canopy. The veteran, non-commissioned officer had participated in successful night assaults across the Pacific, but this was different. The American fire was too accurate, too sustained, too well coordinated to be the product of panicked defenders firing wildly into the darkness. These Marines were shooting with purpose, and Japanese soldiers were dying faster than they could advance. By midnight, Kawaguchi faced a choice that would define the battle. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to discover what he did, the final gamble. By midnight, Kawaguchi's assault had lost all momentum, his forces scattered and disorganized across the jungle approaches to the ridge. The general faced a choice that would define the remainder of the battle: continue feeding his remaining forces into what had become a killing field, or acknowledge that his initial strategy had failed. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 14th, he prepared to stake everything on a final coordinated assault that would either break the Marine defense or destroy what remained of his command. Edson moved through his positions, assessing ammunition supplies and redistributing his forces to cover the gaps that 4 hours of continuous combat had opened in his defensive line. The Marines had performed magnificently, but they were showing the strain of sustained action. Private Leckie had fired over 100 rounds from his Springfield, more ammunition than many Marines expended in an entire month of training. His shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and his hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his 8-round clips by feel in the darkness. The colonel's biggest concern was ammunition for the machine guns. Bassilone's crew had fired nearly 3,000 rounds, changing barrels twice to prevent overheating despite the weapon's water-cooled design. The gunny sergeant reported that he had perhaps 500 rounds remaining, enough for another sustained engagement, but not sufficient for a prolonged battle. Kawaguchi had learned from his earlier failures, and his final assault reflected a more sophisticated understanding of American defensive capabilities. Instead of launching mass frontal attacks that played to Marine strengths, he divided his remaining forces into smaller infiltration groups tasked with penetrating the American perimeter and attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. What happened next would decide the fate of Guadalcanal. Subscribe to War Chronicle X. Close Quarters Hell. The new Japanese approach became apparent when Marine listening posts began reporting movement from sectors that had been quiet during the earlier assaults. Small groups of enemy soldiers were attempting to work their way around the flanks of the American position, using ravines and dense vegetation to mask their approach. The fighting that ensued was unlike anything in the previous assaults. Individual Marines found themselves engaged in close-quarters combat with Japanese soldiers who had penetrated to within 30 yards of key defensive positions. Leckie heard movement in the undergrowth to his left and turned to see a Japanese infiltrator rising from concealment with a grenade in his hand. The young Marine's rifle cracked once, and the enemy soldier collapsed, the grenade rolling harmlessly down the slope to explode among the trees below. Bassilone's position came under direct attack when a Japanese squad managed to approach within grenade range of his machine gun. The gunny sergeant and his crew fought with pistols and rifle stocks as enemy soldiers attempted to storm their sandbag emplacement. One Japanese soldier actually reached the machine gun before Bassilone killed him with a burst from his personal Thompson submachine gun, the dead man's body falling across the weapon's tripod. The intensity of the close combat created chaos along the defensive perimeter, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness in Kawaguchi's new strategy. By dispersing his forces into small infiltration groups, the general had sacrificed the mass and momentum that were essential for breakthrough operations. Instead of concentrating his remaining strength against a single point in the American line, he had spread his forces across multiple objectives, allowing the Marines to defeat each group in detail. As dawn approached, everything changed. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to see the final act. The breaking point. As dawn approached, the character of the battle changed once again. Kawaguchi's infiltration tactics had failed to achieve breakthrough, and daylight would expose his remaining forces to devastating fire from American positions that commanded excellent fields of observation. The Japanese began withdrawing shortly after 5 a.m. in the morning, their movement covered by mortar fire that was poorly coordinated and largely ineffective. Marine observers watched through field glasses as scattered groups of enemy soldiers retreated through the jungle, leaving behind equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the killing ground around the ridge. Edson ordered his forces to maintain their positions and avoid pursuit operations that might expose them to ambush. The colonel understood that his primary mission was defensive, and he had achieved that mission with a tactical victory that exceeded all reasonable expectations. His 800 Marines had not only held their ground against overwhelming odds, but had virtually destroyed an enemy force 3 times their size. The aftermath of annihilation. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of the Japanese defeat. Reconnaissance patrols counted over 700 enemy bodies on the approaches to the ridge, with many more wounded soldiers evacuated during the retreat. American casualties numbered fewer than 50 killed and wounded, a ratio that would have seemed impossible to military analysts studying the preliminary force dispositions. Kawaguchi's failure at the ridge effectively ended Japanese offensive capabilities on Guadalcanal and marked the beginning of a strategic shift that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The Marines had demonstrated that disciplined defenders with superior firepower could defeat numerically superior attackers regardless of their reputation for fanatical courage. More importantly, they had shown that American forces could adapt their tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses while maximizing their own technological and training advantages. The strategic implications would echo across the entire Pacific. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to understand why. The victory that changed everything. The first rays of dawn painted the jungle canopy in shades of gold and green as Edson surveyed the battlefield that stretched below the ridge. What he saw defied every prediction that staff officers had made about Japanese resilience and fighting capability. Bodies lay scattered across the approaches in groupings that told the story of each failed assault, their positions marking the high water mark of what had been one of the most concentrated enemy offensives in the Pacific War. For the Americans, the successful defense of the ridge demonstrated that Japanese forces were not invincible, that superior numbers and fanatical determination could be overcome through professional competence and effective use of firepower. This lesson would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the war, encouraging commanders to trust in their training and equipment when facing seemingly impossible odds. The Japanese response to the defeat revealed fundamental weaknesses in their strategic thinking that had been masked by earlier victories against less prepared opponents. Kawaguchi's brigade, which had numbered over 3,000 men when it departed its staging areas, had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Unit commanders reported casualties exceeding 60%, with many companies reduced to fewer than 20 effective soldiers. The 35th Infantry Brigade, once considered among the most capable formations in the Imperial Japanese Army, had been shattered against the ridge in a single night of fighting. The ridge that witnessed this transformation would bear Edson's name forever. Subscribe to War Chronicle X for more. The legacy of Edson's Ridge. The ridge that had witnessed this transformation in Pacific warfare stood silent in the afternoon heat, its slopes marked by the debris of battle, but no longer contested by opposing forces. For the 800 Marines who had held this ground against overwhelming odds, the victory represented validation of everything they had been taught about warfare, leadership, and the power of disciplined soldiers fighting for a cause they understood and supported. American casualties, while tragic for the families and units involved, represented a remarkably favorable exchange ratio that validated tactical decisions made throughout the engagement. The 43 Marines killed and 97 wounded had inflicted losses on Japanese forces that exceeded 20-1, a ratio that reflected both the defensive advantages of the ridge and the superior effectiveness of American weapons and tactics. The political ramifications of the victory extended beyond military considerations to affect American morale and Japanese strategic calculations throughout the Pacific. News of the successful defense reached the United States at a time when public opinion remained uncertain about American prospects in the Pacific War. The Marine victory provided concrete evidence that Japanese forces could be defeated through superior preparation and professional competence, encouraging continued support for the massive military expansion that would ultimately prove decisive. The ridge that would forever bear Edson's name had become the graveyard of Japanese hopes for victory on Guadalcanal, and the 800 Marines who held it had proven that superior numbers meant nothing against superior preparation, training, and leadership. Join the War Chronicle X community. If this story revealed something you never knew about World War II, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories of impossible victories that changed history. Subscribe to War Chronicle X to discover the untold histories of courage and tactical brilliance. From outnumbered defenders to the battles that defied logic, we bring you the stories that textbooks miss. Drop a comment below. What other impossible battles do you want us to cover? Our community spans from military veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept defeat. Remember, superior numbers mean nothing against superior tactics, training, and the unbreakable will of warriors who refuse to quit. Subscribe to War Chronicle X now and never miss another story that changed the world.